She overheard him say it. "I've seen cleverer housemaids." She said nothing, finished her work, left the room. What Julian Wren didn't know was that the woman he'd just dismissed had survived the French Revolution, carried a noble name older than his title, and was about to make him regret every word. The wind came off the channel in October like a personal grievance. Dunmore Cove had no village to speak of, a huddle of fishermen's cottages below the cliff, a church that had been losing its argument with the salt air for 2 centuries, and above it all, set back from the edge with the particular arrogance of old money, Dunmore House. 12 bedrooms, 1 functional chimney in 3. A library that had not been properly catalogued since the reign of George II, and which smelled of damp and consequence in equal measure. In late October, the house was closed. The summer guests had gone in September. The upper staff had followed in their wake. What remained was a cook who lived in the village and came up each morning, a groundsman who communicated exclusively through the condition of the gravel, and one housemaid who had nowhere better to be. Her name, as far as Dunmore House was concerned, was Isabeau Renaud, 24 years old, French, quiet. She did her work without complaint and her thinking without advertisement, which were, in the opinion of the housekeeper Mrs. Doyle, now wintering in Bath with her sister, the 2 most valuable qualities a housemaid could possess. What Mrs. Doyle did not know and had not thought to ask was why a girl of Isabeau's particular quality of stillness had ended up at Dunmore House at all. At 9:30 on a Thursday morning in October, Isabeau was in the library. She was not supposed to be in the library. There was no rule against it exactly. No rule had been necessary because no previous housemaid had shown the inclination. The library was cold, the chairs were stiff, and the books were in French, Latin, and a quantity of Greek that had defeated 3 generations of Wrens. None of these things deterred Isabeau Renaud. She sat in the chair nearest the window, the one with the view of the sea, with a volume open in her lap. On her right hand, catching what thin light the October sky was willing to offer, was a ring, gold, plain banded, with an engraving on the inner face that was not visible from across the room. She wore it always on her right hand, never the left. She was on page 47. She had been on page 47 for 3 weeks, because reading the same page repeatedly was not the same as not reading, and some pages required more than one visit. She heard the carriages at 10:30. Isabeau closed the book, replaced it on the shelf in its correct position. She had, over the past 6 weeks, quietly reorganized the French section by century and then by subject, a project she had not mentioned to anyone, and went downstairs to be where she was supposed to be. The carriages were 2. The first contained luggage and a valet, who descended with the expression of a man who had been promised better. The second contained 3 people, a man and a woman of comfortable middle years, who were introduced to no one and introduced themselves to each other at considerable volume. And last out, as though the carriage itself had required a moment to compose itself before releasing him, Julian Wren, Duke of Wren. He was not what the title suggested. The title suggested someone older, broader, more settled into the shape that rank provides. Julian Wren was 31, lean without being slight, and had the face of a man accustomed to thinking faster than his company, which had given him a habit of looking at things slightly longer than was socially usual, long enough to finish the thought, not long enough to be accused of staring. He looked at the house first, then at the sky, then briefly and without apparent interest at Isabeau standing at the top of the steps. She met his gaze and did not drop hers. This was not defiance, it was simply how she looked at things. Behind him, Henry Allerdale descended from the carriage with a noise of profound relief, as though he had escaped something. "Ground," he said to no one in particular. "Bless it." Henry was 34, built for drawing rooms, and possessed of a social energy that operated independently of whether anyone else in the room wanted it. He had been Julian's friend since school, which meant he had survived long enough to know which of Julian's silences meant thinking and which meant danger. He was not always reliable about which was which. "Wren," he said, arriving at Julian's shoulder. "The sea, precisely as you described, cold and present." "I described nothing," Julian said. He was still looking at the house. "You said coastal, I filled in the rest, I was optimistic." Henry turned and noticed Isabeau. His expression arranged itself into something welcoming. "Ah, you must be—" "Renaud," Isabeau said. "Housemaid, sir. If you'll follow me, I'll show you to your rooms." Henry blinked at the efficiency of this. Julian said nothing. He was already walking. The rooms were in order. Isabeau had spent the previous day making certain of it. Fires laid, linens aired, the persistent damp of the east corridor addressed as thoroughly as it could be addressed, which was imperfectly. The house was old. It had opinions about the weather and expressed them structurally. She showed the married couple, a Mr. and Mrs. Farrow she gathered from the luggage tags, to the rose bedroom which had the best outlook and the most reliable chimney. She showed Henry to the blue room, which had a tolerable outlook and a chimney that worked if you didn't startle it. She showed Julian Wren to the master suite, which she had known she would do and did not linger. He said as she turned to go, "The fire." She turned back. "Your Grace?" "It should be higher." The fire was adequate. It would be more than adequate in 20 minutes. She crossed the room, knelt and adjusted it without comment. She was aware of him standing behind her in the way one is aware of weather, not threatening, simply present and significant. She stood. "Will there be anything else, Your Grace?" He was looking at the mantelpiece. A small porcelain figure that had been there since she arrived, a shepherdess, faintly absurd, had been moved 6 inches to the left, which was where it looked better, which was why she had moved it. He was looking at it with the expression of a man who has noticed something and is not yet sure what to do with the noticing. "No," he said without turning. She left. Dinner that night was 4 people at a table built for 14, which was the sort of social geometry that made Henry visibly unhappy. He compensated by talking enough for the absent 10. Isabeau served. This was, in the skeleton staff reality of Dunmore Cove in October, her function along with everything else. She laid the fire, she dressed the table, she carried the dishes from the kitchen and returned the empties. She kept her eyes on the task and her expression on nothing at all. The Farrows were discussing a cousin's engagement. Henry was discussing the engagement's implications for someone else's season. Julian was eating with the focused attention of a man who had decided that the food was the most interesting thing available. "And Clarissa will be beside herself," Mrs. Farrow was saying, "because everyone knows she had hopes in that direction, and now—" "Clarissa has hopes in every direction," Henry said. "She is meteorologically optimistic." "Henry," Julian said without looking up. "I meant it as a compliment." "I know what you meant." Isabeau set down the next course. The serving dish was heavier than expected, a miscalculation on her part, and the placement was half an inch further left than it should have been, which meant the presentation was slightly off, which was not the sort of thing that should matter and did. Julian looked at it, then at her. She corrected the position and stepped back. "Wren," Henry said, "has this place a decent cellar or are we to suffer?" "The cellar is adequate." "Your threshold for adequacy continues to astound me." Henry leaned back. "What I want, what I require, is something that doesn't taste like the sea came inside." "Everything at Dunmore tastes of the sea." "That is not a defense, it is a diagnosis." Julian almost smiled. Isabeau saw it because she was there and she was not blind, and she noted it the way one notes things that are filed under unexpected and left there. "The housemaid arrangement," Henry said, gesturing vaguely at the table, "seems a slight excess of responsibility for one person. Did the full staff not stay on?" "October," Julian said. "Yes, I know it's October. I was in the carriage that brought us here. Staff don't winter here. Mrs. Doyle goes to Bath, the rest follow." Henry looked at Isabeau with the mild, uncomplicated curiosity of a man who does not mean harm by it. "And you stayed?" "Yes, sir," Isabeau said. "Bravely done." He said it simply, as though it were obvious. "I'd have been in Bath with Mrs. Doyle." "Henry," Julian said, "the wine." Henry subsided. Julian reached for his glass. "Although," Henry said, not quite subsiding, "I do think we might have brought more staff, or warned the staff we were bringing. How long were you given to prepare, Miss Renaud, was it?" 2 days, sir." Henry looked at the table, the correctly laid silverware. The 3 courses arrived without incident, the fire behind them burning at exactly the right level. He looked at Julian. Julian was looking at his wine. 2 days, Henry repeated. "Wren, I've seen cleverer arrangements from estates with a staff of 20. Julian set down his glass. His tone was easy, unhurried, the tone of a man making a mild and unremarkable observation. "I've seen cleverer housemaids." Isabeau was at the sideboard. She did not turn. She completed the task she was performing, removing the empty bread plate, replacing it with nothing, because there was nothing to replace it with. And then she left the room. Henry watched the door. Julian refilled his own glass. That, Henry said after a moment, was— "The pheasant is good," Julian said. Henry looked at him, then at the door, then at his plate. "Yes," he said, "it is." The kitchen was cold in the way kitchens are cold when the cook has gone home and the fires are banked and there is no one left to perform the business of warmth. Isabeau set the bread plate down on the table. She stood for a moment with her hands flat on the wood. "I've seen cleverer housemaids." She was not angry. Or rather, she was angry in the way she had learned to be angry, which was quietly and at a slight remove from the feeling, as though it belonged to someone she was watching rather than someone she was. She had been practicing this for 4 years. She was very good at it. She straightened. She began to clear the remaining dishes for washing. On her right hand, the ring caught the low light of the banked kitchen fire and gave it back. The house had a rhythm in the early morning that was entirely Isabeau's. Before the cook arrived, before the guests descended, there was an hour or sometimes 2 in which Dunmore Cove belonged to the sea and to her and to no one else. She used it. The kitchen fire first, then the main hall fire, then whatever the day's particular demands were. On Friday morning, the particular demand was the linen press, which had developed an opinion about the damp and needed addressing. She was doing this at 5:30 when she heard footsteps on the back stair. Not the heavy tread of Henry, who moved through the world as though it owed him traction. Not the measured step of Mr. Farrow, who was the kind of man who walked as he spoke, at regulated intervals with no surprises. These were quieter. Someone who knew how not to wake a house. Julian Wren appeared in the kitchen doorway in his shirt sleeves. Isabeau had her hands in the linen press. She did not startle. She turned and looked at him and waited. He looked at her, then at the table, where a pamphlet was sitting beside her candlestick. She had been reading it when the footsteps started. She had not moved it because moving it would have been a kind of confession. She left it where it was. Julian crossed the kitchen to the cold range, examining the process of making it less cold, with the expression of a man who knows the theory but has no practice. Isabeau set down the linen, moved him aside without comment, and lit the range herself. "Thank you," he said after a moment. "Your Grace should not be in the kitchen." "Your Grace is aware." He looked at the pamphlet. "What is that?" "Old news." "Everything is old news eventually. What specifically?" She had said old news, the way people say things when they are hoping the conversation will move on, and it hadn't. And now she was in the position of having said something evasive to a man who did not appear to find evasion satisfying. "A pamphlet," she said, "from Paris, 1791. Nearly 30 years old." "Approximately." He sat down, which was so unexpected that she did not respond to it for a moment. He sat at the kitchen table, in the chair she had been sitting in, and looked at the pamphlet without touching it. His presence in the kitchen was wrong in the way that a painting hung slightly askew is wrong. Not ruined, just disorienting. "Why 1791, he said. "It was what was available." "At the lending library in this particular pamphlet?" She met his gaze. He was not mocking her, he was genuinely asking. "It belonged to my father," she said. "He kept it because it was the last reasonable thing published before everything stopped being reasonable." Julian said nothing. He looked at the pamphlet. "Will your Grace require breakfast before the cook arrives?" Isabeau said. "No," he stood. "Thank you for the fire." He left. Isabeau listened to his footsteps go back up the stair, quiet, unhurried, precisely as they had come down, and then she sat at the table for a moment before she resumed the linen. She did not look at the pamphlet again. She knew what page 47 said. Henry found Isabeau in the corridor outside the dining room at 11 that morning, which was Henry's natural hunting hour. He had the look of a man who had been meaning to explore the house and had found something more interesting. "Renaud," he said with the warmth of someone who has already decided he likes you. "Tell me about the cove. Is there a path down to the beach, or does one simply fall?" "There is a path, sir. It begins at the east gate and requires some attention in wet weather." "And is it wet?" "It rained last night." "So, attention is required." "Yes, sir." Henry fell into step beside her, which was not something guests usually did, and began talking about the cove, the cliff, the state of the path, the philosophical implications of walking in wet conditions, the general unfairness of October, and whether the cook had any opinion on kippers. Isabeau answered what required answering. She offered nothing supplementary. Henry seemed to find this arrangement entirely satisfying. "You're very efficient," he said at the end of the corridor. "Thank you, sir. I meant it as an observation, not entirely a compliment, though perhaps it is both." He tilted his head. "How long have you been here?" "At Dunmore, sir, since April." "And before that?" "London." "And before London?" She looked at him. He was asking the way Henry asked everything, without calculation, simply because he wanted to know. There was no malice in it. There was also no particular right to it. "Before London was some time ago," she said. Henry held up his hands in cheerful surrender. "Of course, forgive me. I am constitutionally incapable of not asking questions. Wren says it will be my ruin, and he is probably not wrong." He smiled at her. It was a good smile, easy, undemanding. "He also says I am an excellent companion despite it, so perhaps it balances." His Grace said that? He implied it, which for Wren is practically a speech. Henry glanced toward the library. "He's in there, you know. Has been since breakfast. Do you know if there's anything worth reading, or is it all Greek and misery?" "There is a reasonable French section," Isabeau said, and then stopped because she had said it with the confidence of someone who has spent 6 weeks reorganizing it, and that was not something a housemaid who had never entered the library should possess. Henry's eyes moved to her face. She saw him notice. She waited to see what he would do with the noticing. "French," he said pleasantly. "How useful, I'll tell him." He wandered off toward the morning room. Isabeau continued down the corridor and did not look back. The storm arrived on Saturday and settled in with the air of something that had made prior arrangements. By afternoon the windows were running white, and the sea had gone the color of pewter, and the wind was producing a sound in the chimney of the east sitting room that Henry described as operatic, which was more generous than it deserved. The Farrows retreated to their room with cards and each other. Henry colonized the morning room with a novel and a blanket. Julian went to the library. Isabeau went to the library to lay the fire. He was at the table reading. She came in, went to the hearth and began the work of laying the grate, the old ash out, the new kindling placed correctly, the coal in its proper sequence. This was the kind of work that she could do without looking, which was useful because what she would have been looking at was Julian Wren reading the volume she had been reading for 6 weeks. He had not taken it from the French section intentionally. He could not have. She had reorganized the French section quietly, and the reorganization made sense if you were French and had opinions about the 17th century, and made no sense at all if you were an English duke selecting something at random. He had picked it up because it was on the table by the window. She had left it on the table by the window because she was not expecting anyone to be in the library. He was on page 12. She lit the fire, stood, and began to go. "Renaud." She stopped. "Your Grace." He had not looked up from the book. "The fire." "It will draw in a moment. The flue is cold." He turned a page. She waited. The fire began tentatively to draw. On her right hand the ring caught the new light. "This is good," he said of the book. She said nothing. He looked up then and looked at her hand and the ring and then at her face. The look lasted half a second. "Will there be anything else, Your Grace?" "No," he said. "Thank you." She left. Behind her she heard the page turn. The letter arrived Sunday, carried by a rider who looked as though he had argued with the weather the entire way from London and lost. Isabeau brought it to Julian in the library. He looked at the seal, and something in his face that had been, not relaxed exactly, but at rest, closed. He read it standing, he folded it, he put it in his coat. For the remainder of Sunday he was a different quality of present. Not unkind, not any more specifically unkind than his general register, which was precise rather than warm, but flattened somehow, as though he had reduced himself down to the minimum required. At supper he was short with Henry twice, and not with the Farrows at all, which meant he was performing. Henry, who understood the landscape, performed back, voluble, undemanding, filling the silences with enough noise that no one was required to inhabit them. Monday morning Isabeau brought his breakfast tray. He was standing at the window with his back to the room. "Set it down," he said. She set it down. "Renaud." She waited. He turned from the window. He looked at the tray and at her, and then he said, not at her precisely, but in her direction, which was the nearest available target. "The arrangement of this room is intolerable. The desk faces the wrong wall. The light is entirely wrong. How has no one addressed this in the history of this house?" The desk had been against that wall since before Isabeau arrived. The light was the same light it had always been. The room was cold because the fire was not yet lit, which was something she was there to do, and had not yet done, because he had been speaking. She crossed to the fireplace and lit it. "Shall I have the desk moved, Your Grace?" "No." He sat down at the badly positioned desk and looked at the tray. "Leave it." She moved to go. "The coffee is cold," he said. It was not. She had carried it directly from the kitchen. She turned. "I can bring fresh, Your Grace." "This will do." A pause. Then, without inflection, "The arrangement of the tray is acceptable." This was so clearly the closest he was capable of arriving at an apology that she almost said something. She did not. She collected what she had come to collect, and she moved to the door, and then she said from the doorway, without turning, "Shall I remove the tray, Your Grace, or only the conversation?" Silence. She left. She was halfway down the corridor before she heard it. Brief, involuntary, quickly suppressed. The sound of a man who has just laughed when he didn't mean to. The Farrows departed Tuesday. A letter from Mrs. Farrow's mother, Isabeau gathered this from the quantity of sighing that accompanied the packing, had summoned them back to Surrey with the implication that delay would constitute a moral failing. The carriage was called, the luggage descended. Mrs. Farrow kissed Henry on the cheek and told Julian it had been lovely, which was generous of her, and then they were gone, and the house contracted around the three of them like a coat that suddenly fits. Henry rearranged himself. He had the knack of expanding or contracting to fill the social space available, which was either a gift or a symptom, and Isabeau had not yet decided which. That evening, without apparent design, Henry placed himself at the small table in the morning room for supper. A more intimate arrangement than the dining room, he explained, given the reduced numbers and the entirely reasonable desire not to sit at a table for 14 like 3 pins in a bowling alley. Isabeau served at the smaller table. The wall between the morning room and the servants' corridor was not thick. "The thing I cannot determine," Henry was saying as she returned with the next course, "is how long you intend to stay." "I said a fortnight." "You said perhaps a fortnight, which is not the same." "It is similar." "Julian." Henry's voice shifted. Not serious exactly, but less performed. "The Holcroft girl is in London. Her father is in London. Your mother is in London. The solicitors are, I assume, also in London, given that they are always in London, and that is what solicitors do. Then they are well positioned to wait." A brief silence. "You cannot wait indefinitely." "I am not waiting indefinitely. I am waiting a fortnight." "And then?" "And then I will have waited a fortnight." Isabeau set the dish down and left before she could hear what Henry said next. She did not need to hear it. The architecture of the conversation was clear enough. The Duke of Wren had come to the coast to avoid a woman. The woman was in London. London was sending letters. She went back to the kitchen and stood for a moment with her hands flat on the cold table, the way she had stood the first night. The ring caught the firelight. She did not look at it. On Wednesday evening, Isabeau was in the library. She had given up the pretense of not being there after hours. The household was reduced to 3, 2 of whom went to bed before 11, and the third of whom she had found in the kitchen at 5 in the morning, and who therefore had no remaining claim to surprise. She sat in the chair by the window. She had not lit the lamp. The moon was enough, or close enough. The book was open in her lap, but she was looking at the sea. She heard the door. Julian stopped when he saw her. She did not move. They regarded each other across the dark library with the mutual acknowledgement of 2 people who have been caught at the same thing. He came in. He did not light the lamp either. He went to the table where he had left his own book and picked it up, and then he sat in the other chair, the one that did not face the window, and opened it, and read, which was the most extraordinary thing either of them had done in the other's presence so far. After a few minutes, Isabeau looked back at the sea. "How long?" Julian said, without looking up from his page. "Have you been in England?" 4 years, Your Grace." "Where were you before England?" "France." She paused. "Before it became a different country." He was still. She could see it from the edge of her vision, the slight cessation of movement that is not quite stopping but is near enough. He recognized what that meant. She saw that he recognized it. He turned a page. "Where in France?" "Bordeaux latterly. Before that, Paris." "And your family?" The question landed in the room with the particular weight of a question that cannot be retracted. He seemed to know it, because he looked up. she said. "There is no family now, Your Grace." He held her gaze for a moment and then looked back at his book. He did not offer condolence. She was grateful. Condolence, in her experience, was something English people offered when they wanted the conversation to feel concluded without having to continue it. They read in silence for another 20 minutes. The sea moved outside the window. The fire reduced itself to coals. Isabeau closed her book. "Good night, Your Grace." "Good night, Renaud." She was at the door when he said, "The French section." She stopped. "It has been reorganized," he said, "by century and then by subject within each century." A pause. "Yes," she said. "The 17th century political philosophy is shelved beside the devotional texts from the same period. That is an interesting curatorial decision. They are in conversation with each other," she said. It seemed appropriate to shelve them that way. She heard him consider this. "Yes," he said finally, "it does." She left. Thursday breakfast. Henry had at some point in the night decided something. Isabeau could tell because he was managing his expression, which was a thing Henry was not ordinarily required to do and was not very good at. He buttered his toast. He looked at the window, he looked at Julian, he looked at Isabeau, who was refilling his coffee. "The French situation," he said to no one specifically, "is extraordinary when you consider it. An entire class of people simply gone. One decade to the next." He shook his head. He was working towards something. Isabeau could see the architecture of it. Henry accelerating toward a point without noticing the terrain. "One hears," he continued, "that many of the émigré families were in quite, that is, they were not, there were situations of considerable difficulty." "Henry," Julian said. Henry stopped. He had been about to say something about émigré families that was neither unkind nor untrue, and was also none of his business and not his story to handle at breakfast. He stopped because Julian said his name with the exact precise weight that meant stop, and Henry, for once, heard it. He looked at his toast. "Good coffee this morning," he said. "Yes," Julian said. Isabeau refilled Julian's cup. She did not look at him. He did not look at her. But the intervention had occurred, and they both knew it had occurred, and the space between them was different now in a way she did not yet have a word for. She left the dining room and stood in the corridor for precisely 3 seconds, which was all she permitted herself, and then she went to attend to the morning rooms. That night the London letter came again. Isabeau knew because she saw Julian take it from the Evening Post in the hall, and she saw what his hand did. A brief, almost imperceptible tightening before he made himself hold it normally. He went to the study. He closed the door. She was passing on the upstairs landing an hour later when she saw him through the window. He was below in the garden, standing at the edge of the cliff path in the dark, hands behind his back, looking at the sea. This was apparently what the Duke of Rennes did with correspondence that displeased him. He took it to the edge of things. The moon was up. She could see the pale flash of the ring on her own hand, where she rested it on the window frame. She watched him for a moment, a thing she was not supposed to do and did not examine too closely, and then she stepped back from the window before he looked up. He did look up. She was already gone. Friday morning, Julian found Henry in the morning room after breakfast. "I shall stay," Julian said, "another fortnight." Henry looked up from his newspaper. He looked at Julian. He looked at the door in the direction of the kitchen from which the sound of morning tasks was faintly audible. He looked back at Julian. "Another fortnight," he said. "Yes." "The solicitors will wait. Your mother will also wait." Henry set down his newspaper with the careful deliberateness of a man choosing not to say several things. He folded it. He picked up his coffee. He took a sip. He set it down. "Right," he said. Julian looked at him. Henry produced an expression of comprehensive neutrality and held it. "So you have nothing to say," Julian said. "I have a great many things to say," Henry said. "I am refraining, which I hope you are noting, because it costs me more than you know." Julian said nothing. "Another fortnight," Henry said to his newspaper. "Extraordinary." He picked the newspaper back up. Julian left the room. Henry waited until the footsteps were gone, and then he looked at the door to the kitchen corridor and raised his coffee cup in a private, ironic toast to whatever it was that was happening in this house. "So extraordinary," he said again quietly to himself, and meant it entirely differently the second time. That evening Isabeau was crossing the garden in the dark when she felt it, the specific quality of being observed, not watched in the threatening sense, observed in the way one observes something that is being thought about. She did not look up at the windows. She completed her errand. The groundsman had left a gate unlatched and the wind was making a project of it, and latched it and turned back to the house. As she crossed the gravel, she glanced up, quickly and without intention, at the first-floor windows. Nothing, dark glass reflecting the moon. She went inside. Above her, in the window of the master suite, Julian Wren stood 3 feet back from the glass in the dark, and did not move for another 10 minutes. On her right hand, as she crossed the hall below, the ring caught the light of the entrance lamp and threw a brief gold arc against the wall. He did not see it, but it was there. The ring was not where it was supposed to be. Isabeau noticed at 7 in the morning, which was when she noticed everything: the fire, the tray, the state of the linen, the ring. It was not on her hand. She stood in the kitchen with the cold range and the grey October light, and thought back through the previous evening with the systematic precision of someone who has learned not to panic, because panic is expensive, and she had been unable to afford it for 4 years. The garden, the unlatched gate. She had been pulling at it with both hands in the wind, and the ring was loose. It had always been slightly loose, fitted for her mother's hand and not hers, and the wind had been considerable. She went to the garden. She found the gate. She found the gravel around it, crouched, looked. The wind had picked up again overnight. The gravel had shifted. She searched for 10 minutes in the thin morning light and found nothing, and then she stood and breathed very carefully and went back inside. She did not find it until noon, and she did not find it herself. Julian came to the kitchen doorway at 12 o'clock with his hand extended, and in his palm was the ring. Isabeau set down what she was holding. She crossed to him and held out her hand, and he placed it in her palm, and then he did not step back. He looked at the ring. "Where did you find it?" she said. "By the east gate. I was walking the cliff path." He paused. It caught the light. She put it on. Right hand. The correct finger. She watched herself do it and was aware of him watching also. "The engraving," he said. She looked up. "I saw the engraving," he said. "I did not read it, but I saw that it was there." This was offered as information, not as demand. She understood the distinction. She could leave it here, say, "Thank you, Your Grace," take the ring back to the kitchen and the morning and the life she had constructed in this house, and he would let her. He was giving her the choice. She did not take it. "It is my family's device," she said. He waited. "Not Renaud," she said. "The name beneath Renaud." He was very still. Outside the kitchen window, the sea moved with its usual indifference. "What is the name beneath Renaud?" he said. She told him. He looked at her for a long moment. The name was not Renaud. The name was old, and it was Bordelais, and it was the kind of name that anyone with a thorough knowledge of pre-revolutionary France, or a particular interest in its history, or access to a well-organized library with a 17th century political philosophy section, would recognize. He recognized it. "Why are you here?" he said, not unkindly, simply. She had been asked this before in various forms, in various registers, by Mrs. Doyle, by the agency in London, by the woman in Portsmouth who had found her off the boat with nothing and helped her find the agency. She had given different answers to all of them, calibrated to what was needed. She gave Julian Wren the only answer that was true. Because England was what was left. He said nothing. She waited for him to say something about the position, about the impossibility of her being here, in this kitchen, with that name and that ring and 4 years of swallowed history. But he didn't. He leaned against the kitchen doorframe and looked at the floor, and the silence was not uncomfortable, which was the strangest thing. "My mother died in 1803, she said. She had not intended to say more. She said more. "My father in 1805. I was 11 when he died. I was sent to relatives in Bordeaux, and then the relatives ran, and I ran with them, and eventually running ended in Portsmouth." She paused. "I was 20. I had the ring and the pamphlet and the name, and in England the name meant nothing, and I discovered that this was in some respects useful." He looked up. "A name that means nothing," she said, "allows you to be anyone." "And who did you choose?" "I chose this." She gestured at the kitchen, the tray, the ordered domestic world of Dunmore Cove. "It is quiet. It is sufficient." "Is it?" She met his eyes. He was asking honestly. "Some days," she said. He nodded, as though this were a complete and satisfying answer. Then he straightened from the doorframe and said, "Renaud is not a bad name. It sounds like something that survived. He left. Isabeau stood in the kitchen for a moment. Her right hand closed around the ring and felt something she had not felt in quite this form before. Not hope exactly. Something that had the shape of hope, without the danger of being named yet. She opened her hand. The ring sat in her palm, gold and plain, and engraved with a name that had once meant something and was beginning, in small and illegible ways, to mean something again. She put it on and went back to work. That evening Julian did not go to the study. He went to the library, and he was there when Isabeau came to bank the fire before bed, and he said, without looking up from his book, "Sit down." She did not sit down, she banked the fire. "I will sit when the fire is done," she said. He waited. She finished. She sat in her chair, the one by the window, which had apparently become hers in some unspoken domestic negotiation. The moon was up. The sea was silver. "Tell me about the marriage," she said. He looked up sharply. "I heard enough of the conversation with Mr. Allerdale," she said. "I'm not asking for what I have not partly been told. I am asking for the rest." He held her gaze. Then he closed his book. "The Holcroft family," he said. "Sir Edmund Holcroft. His daughter is 22. She is accomplished and amiable by report, and her family has a particular interest in the income from certain of my entailed properties in the north, which has declined alongside my own. A marriage would allow the Holcroft settlement to service the debts presently secured against those estates. It is a practical arrangement, dressed as a social one." "And you object?" "I object," he said, "to the method. Not particularly to the girl. She has done nothing wrong. But—" He looked at her steadily. "I came here," he said, "because London was full of people telling me what I owe the title, which is a great deal, and what I owe myself." He paused. "Which they have not calculated." Isabeau looked at the fire. "My father," she said, "believed that obligation and desire were the same thing in a good man. That if you were good enough, what you wanted and what you owed would eventually coincide. Did he find that to be true?" "He died in 1805, she said, "so the answer is inconclusive." Julian looked at her. Something in his face shifted, not softened exactly, but released the way a held breath releases. He almost smiled, which was not the appropriate response to what she had said, and was exactly the correct one. "You are," he said, "not what I expected." "I am not what anyone expects, Your Grace. I have found it useful. I meant it differently." "I know," she said. "I am choosing to answer it this way." He looked at her for a moment, then, "Julian." She met his eyes. "Your Grace?" "My name," he said. "You know it. You could use it." The fire shifted. A coal settled. The room was very quiet. "That would not be appropriate," she said. "No," he agreed. "It would not be." A pause. "Isabeau." The sound of her name, her real name, not Renaud, not the housemaid, not Miscund in his voice, in this room, was something she had not prepared for. She looked at the fire. "Good night," she said. She stood. "Good night," he said. He did not add her name again. He did not need to. She left. Behind her she heard him open his book, but she did not hear a page turn for a long time. Saturday. Henry came downstairs to find Julian already at breakfast, which was unusual, and Isabeau clearing the sideboard with the concentrated attention of someone performing a task with great thoroughness, which was not unusual, except that the sideboard had clearly already been cleared once. Henry looked at the sideboard. He looked at Julian. He sat down. "Lovely morning," he said. "Is it?" Julian said. Henry looked at the window, where rain was conducting an aggressive campaign against the glass. "Figuratively," he said. He accepted coffee from Isabeau without looking at her, because he was looking at Julian, who was not looking at Isabeau, which was itself a kind of looking. "What are we doing today? I have correspondence to attend to." "You always have correspondence to attend to. What are we doing that is not that?" Julian looked up. He looked at Isabeau, who was leaving the room. He said, "I am going to write to London." Henry went very still. "I'm going to tell them," Julian said, "that the matter requires more time." "More time," Henry repeated. "Yes." Henry picked up his coffee. He set it down. He picked it up again. "Julian, I know what you're going to say." "I am going to say several things, and I don't know which one to start with, which is unprecedented." Henry pressed his fingers together. "You are a duke." "I am aware." "And she is—" "I know what she is," Julian said. "I also know what she was. The two things are not as separate as this house would suggest." Henry stared at him. "You know, how do you—" "The ring." A pause. Henry looked at the door through which Isabeau had gone. "Good God," he said quietly. "Yes." "And she told you?" "Yes." Henry sat back. He was doing something Isabeau had never seen him do, which was to be genuinely fully quiet. It lasted for approximately 15 seconds, which was probably a record. "Right," he said. He picked up his coffee. "Well, right." Julian waited. "I will simply say," Henry said carefully, "that there are realities, that those realities are significant, and that I note them for the record." He drank his coffee. "And then I will say—" He stopped. "Say it, Henry." Henry looked at him. "She is remarkable," he said simply. "Whatever else is true." Julian looked at the door. "Yes," he said, "she is." The solicitor arrived on Monday. Not a letter this time. The man himself, a Mr. Crane, spare and precise, who descended from a hired carriage with a leather case and the expression of someone who has been sent because letters have stopped working. Isabeau opened the door. Mr. Crane looked at her. He looked at the house. He said, "I am here to see His Grace the Duke of Wren. Please inform him that Mr. Crane has arrived on behalf of—" "I know who you are," Isabeau said. "Please come in." She showed him to the morning room and went to find Julian. She found him in the library. He was standing, which meant he had heard the carriage. He was looking at the shelf, the French section, reorganized by 17th century philosophy beside devotional text. And he was very still. "Mr. Crane is in the morning room, Your Grace." He turned. He looked at her. Something passed across his face. "Thank you," he said. She moved to go. "Isabeau." She stopped. He almost never used her name. When he did, the room changed shape. "Wait here," he said. "I will not be long." She waited in the library. She went to the window. Below, the cliff path was visible, the sea beyond it pewter-colored and restless, the same sea that had been there every morning and would be there regardless of what occurred in the morning room. She turned the ring on her finger, clockwise once, a habit she had not noticed until recently. He was back in 20 minutes. He came into the library and closed the door behind him with the precision of a man controlling something, and then he leaned against it and looked at the ceiling for a moment. "He is staying the night," Julian said. "He insists on a formal answer by tomorrow. What will you tell him?" He looked at her. "I don't know yet." This was the most honest thing. She recognized it as such. "The girl, Miss Holcroft," she began, "is not part of this conversation." "She should be. She is a person, not a variable." He was quiet for a moment. "You're right," he said. "She is, and she deserves better than a man who does not want to marry her." He met Isabeau's eyes. "That is what I will tell Mr. Crane, that the Holcroft arrangement is not something I can proceed with." Isabeau looked at him. "That is not—" She stopped. "You understand what you are refusing. Considerable pressure and a resolution to my financial complications, yes." "Your Grace." "Julian," he said, "I have asked you twice." The fire cracked. The wind pushed at the window. She looked at the sea and at the cliff path and at the pale gold ring on her hand. "So you are refusing the marriage," she said, "because you are here, because of October at Dunmore Cove, because of—" She stopped. "Because of all of those things," he said, "and one thing in particular." She did not ask what the one thing was. She did not need to. "I am a housemaid," she said, not with bitterness, as information. "You are Isabeau, of a name I recognize, who has read everything in my library and reorganized it correctly, and who told me the truth when she could have said nothing, and who has been arguing with me obliquely since the first evening." He paused. "The housemaid part is a function of circumstance, not of what you are." She looked at him steadily. "England will not see it that way." "England," he said, "is not currently in this room." The moment held. She turned the ring on her finger once clockwise. He watched her do it. "I will speak to Mr. Crane," he said. "The rest can wait." He left. Isabeau remained at the window. Below, the cliff path ran to the edge of things and the sea moved, and the light was the particular gold of late afternoon, and she stood very still and tried to decide what she was feeling. She was feeling something she had not permitted herself in 4 years, which was the terrifying possibility that things might become, in some not yet nameable way, better. She turned from the window and went to attend to the evening. Henry found Julian in the study after supper. He closed the door behind him, which already signaled that this was a Henry operating at unusual altitude. "Right," Henry said. I am going to speak and you are going to listen, and when I am finished you may say whatever you like, but you will have heard me. Julian looked at him. She is not what England will expect, Henry said. I do not mean this as an objection. I mean it as a fact that requires strategy, not sentiment. Her name, the real one, means something to those who know France, and there are those who know France. But she has been Renaud for 4 years, and Renaud is nothing, and that is both the problem and the solution, because— He stopped, restarted. What I am attempting to say is that this is possible. Not easy, not without cost, but possible. Julian waited. I am not advising against it, Henry said. I want that noted. I am advising with eyes open. A pause. Also— His voice changed, became for a moment simple. She suits you. Julian looked at him. I know how that sounds, Henry said. I do not mean it in the drawing-room sense. I mean she is— When you are in the room with her, you are less— He made a gesture. You are less of what you use as armor. A long silence. Henry, Julian said, thank you. Don't, Henry said. I will deny this entire conversation. I know. I will deny it completely and without hesitation. I know, Henry. Henry exhaled. Good. He straightened his coat. What did you tell Crane? That the Holcroft arrangement cannot proceed. Henry absorbed this. He will go back to London tomorrow. Yes. And London will react accordingly. Your mother will also react accordingly. Julian looked at him. I find I can endure it. Henry looked at him for a long moment. Then he nodded once, the nod of a man who has decided something and is not going back from it. Right, he said. Well, he moved to the door. There is a decent bottle in the cellar. I found it this afternoon. Shall we— Yes, Julian said, we shall. Wednesday was clear for the first time in a week. The storm had taken itself elsewhere. The sea was, if not calm, then at least civil, and the cliff path dry to passable by afternoon. Julian found Isabeau at the upstairs window in the late afternoon, the same window where she sometimes stood with her hand on the frame, watching the path or the water or the horizon, a habit that seemed less about seeing than about something to do with her hands. Walk with me, he said. She turned, she looked at him. On the cliff path, he said, not as one, he paused, not as employer, I'm asking you to walk with me. The distinction was clear and deliberate, and cost him something to make, she could see that. She took her shawl from the hook by the window. They went out through the east gate, the gate with the loose latch where the ring had been lost and found, and onto the cliff path. The sea was below them. The wind had softened to something that merely moved the air rather than fighting it. They walked for a few minutes in silence, then Julian said, the first evening. She looked at him. I said something, he said. To Henry at dinner, you were in the room. Yes. You heard it? Yes. He stopped walking. She stopped a half-step later and turned to face him. He was looking at the sea. He considered the word carefully. Careless, with something that was not mine to be careless with. I had not looked at you properly then. He turned to face her. I was wrong. About the cleverness, she said, or about the housemaid? He looked at her. The look lasted a full second, too, the sea moving beneath them, and then something in his face gave way. Not collapsed, not broke, simply gave way, the way a door gives way when the person on the other side finally stops pushing and simply opens it, and he laughed. It was unguarded and genuine and brief, and it transformed him entirely, and she thought that she had been waiting without knowing it to see what he looked like when he did that. Both, he said when he had recovered. I was wrong about both. She looked at him. I know, she said. You knew before I said it. Yes. That is infuriating. I know that too. He looked at her. She held his gaze. The wind moved between them. He took one step toward her and she did not step back, and the distance between them, which had been the calculated and maintained distance of a household, disappeared. He kissed her. It was not tentative. It was the kind of kiss that acknowledges that a great deal of time has been wasted in not doing it, and attempts to address this. She kissed him back with the same understanding. The sea was below them. The house was behind them. Somewhere behind the house, Henry Allerdale, who had followed at what he considered a discreet distance and considered correctly that his presence would not be welcome, turned around and walked back very quickly through the east gate, which he latched carefully behind him. And then he went to find the bottle of wine he had discovered in the cellar, and poured himself a glass, and sat down and said nothing to anyone, which was the greatest act of self-control he had ever performed. They came back from the cliff path with the particular quietness of people who have settled something and are not yet ready to speak it into the ordinary world. The sea light was fading. The house was warm. Henry was in the morning room with his wine, and his expression of comprehensive neutrality, which he maintained heroically. "Good walk," he said. "Yes," Julian said. "Lovely evening for it," Henry said to the window where the last of the light was going. "Bracing." Isabeau took her leave with a good night that was addressed to both of them and collected nothing at all, and went to the kitchen and stood with her hands flat on the cold table, and then she smiled, which was a thing she did not do often, because it had not often been warranted. The morning arrived with the specific clarity that follows storms, when the air has been scrubbed clean, and the light is sharp, and everything is where it is with unusual definition. Julian came to the kitchen at 7, not for the fire, not for inadvertent reasons. He came because he came. Isabeau poured him coffee without being asked. He sat at the kitchen table, the same chair, his chair now by practice, and wrapped both hands around the cup. "There will be considerable difficulty," he said. "I know. My mother will—" "I expect so. Society will—" "Yes." He looked at her. "Are you going to finish any of my sentences this morning? You were not saying anything I needed to hear." He held her gaze. "What do you need to hear?" She thought about it honestly. "Nothing," she said. "I already know what you're going to say. I'm asking myself whether I believe it." "And?" "Ask me again in an hour." He almost smiled. He drank his coffee. She sat across from him at the kitchen table in the place that had been hers since before he arrived, and they were quiet in the way of people who have discovered that they are comfortable in the same silence, which is not a small discovery. The cook arrived at 7:30, took in the scene at the kitchen table and said nothing whatsoever, which was the most tactful performance of 1818. Mr. Crane had gone. London would respond in due course. Julian's mother would respond with greater force and in person, probably before the month was out. None of this had happened yet. What had happened was an October at Dunmore Cove and a library organized by Century, and a ring found on gravel by the East Gate, and a walk on the cliff path, and a conversation that had lasted 3 weeks in small installments, and one moment on the cliff when the distance closed and did not reopen. Julian asked Henry to stay another week. Henry said yes before Julian had finished the sentence, with the enthusiasm of a man who has been waiting to be asked. "I want to be here," Henry said, "for the next part." "There is no next part yet." "There will be," Henry said, "and I want to be present for historical purposes. You will be required to behave." "I always behave." Julian looked at him. "I always intend to behave," Henry amended. "The execution is sometimes approximate." The question Julian asked, he asked badly. He found her in the library. Of course the library, it was always the library, on Thursday evening, and he had apparently been planning what to say, and had planned it into such formal precision that the first sentence came out like a legal document. He stopped. He looked at the ceiling. He started again. The second attempt was too plain, stripped of all the architecture, and suddenly bare in a way that left both of them looking at the floor. He stopped again. In the silence, Isabeau said, "Julian." He looked at her. She was looking at him with the expression she had used from the beginning, direct, clear, giving nothing away, except that now he knew what was behind it, and what was behind it was a woman who had survived a great deal and had come to Dunmore Cove and had stayed. "I know what you are trying to say," she said. "You do not have to find the correct form for it." "I want to say it correctly." "Then say it simply." He looked at her. He said, "I want you to stay, not at Dunmore, not as—" He stopped. "I want you to stay as yourself, whatever form that takes." She was quiet for a moment. "That is not a question," she said. "No," he admitted, "it isn't. Will you—" "Yes," she said. He closed his mouth. "Yes," she said again, more simply. He crossed the room. He took her hand, the right hand, the ringed hand, and held it, and then he did something that surprised her. He looked at the ring. "May I?" he said. She understood what he was asking. She held still while he slid the ring from her right hand and placed it carefully and with full knowledge of what he was doing on her left. She looked at her own hand, the ring on the left finger, the only time it had ever been there. "That," he said quietly, "is where it should be." She looked up at him. "Someday," she said, "I will put it back." "I know," he said, "and I will put something beside it." She looked at him for a long moment, then she did something that surprised him. She put her left hand ringed against his face briefly, the way one touches something true. He turned his head and pressed his mouth to her palm. Henry cried at the wedding. This was not acknowledged by anyone, including Henry, who spent the subsequent 3 minutes at the back of the small coastal church, examining the ceiling with great interest and describing, to anyone who looked at him, a particularly remarkable architectural detail. The church was 2 miles from Dunmore Cove, small, salt-bitten, attended by the vicar, the cook, the groundsman, and Henry. Julian had obtained a special license from London in the fortnight between the proposal and the ceremony. The Archbishop's office moved with surprising efficiency when a duke applied sufficient gravity to the request. No banns, no announcement in advance, no one to whom the news needed to travel before the fact. London would receive its announcement after. Julian's mother received hers by letter, in the writing Julian had used at Dunmore Cove, in the same hand that had written to Mr. Crane. The letter was brief, accurate, and entirely final. Julian told Isabeau what he had written. She said, "And your mother will be angry," he said, "and then she will meet you." "And then?" "And then she will be less angry," he said, "eventually. You have considerable faith in me." "I have evidence," he said. "There is a difference." London, when they arrived in the new year, received the Duchess of Wren with the attention it gives to everything unfamiliar, which is to say, with interest layered over caution, layered over the specific appetite of people who are waiting to see what will happen. What happened was Isabeau. She did not perform. She did not attempt the particular kind of brightness that society expected of women who needed to be accepted. She spoke when she had something to say. She listened when others spoke, with an attentiveness that people found flattering without quite understanding why. She wore the ring on her left hand. She wore it beside it, the ring Julian had placed there in the coastal church, narrow gold, plain. At the first dinner party of consequence, Lady Ashworth's March, the full season not yet begun but beginning, a woman of considerable social force made a remark. Not quite an insult. The kind of remark that has enough plausible distance from insult to be repeated safely. About accents, about origins. Julian, without looking up from his plate, said 3 sentences. Isabeau never learned exactly what the 3 sentences were. She was on the other side of the table, but she saw the effect. The woman's expression, the silence that moved around the table, the way the conversation resumed with a different center of gravity. He had not made a scene, he had simply made a correction. After dinner, when they were in the carriage, she said, "What did you say to her?" He considered. "I observed that her family's connection to their title was, by my count, more recent than she implied, and that people in glass houses might find stone-throwing inconvenient." She looked at him. "I may have been more specific," he said. "Julian, she was rude to you." "People will be rude to me." "Yes," he said, "and I will continue to find it inconvenient. You might as well know that now." She looked at him in the carriage dark. He looked back. She felt something move in her chest, not surprise because she had stopped being surprised by him somewhere around the 3rd week at Dunmore, but something warmer and less manageable than surprise. "Thank you," she said. "There is nothing to thank me for." "Julian." "Isabeau." She took his hand. He turned it over and held hers. They were quiet for the rest of the carriage ride, and it was the good kind of quiet, the kind she had not known existed until a kitchen at 5 in the morning and a man who sat down when no one had told him to. The first child arrived in November of 1819. A girl. Julian was in the doorway of the nursery the following morning, standing precisely where Isabeau used to stand in doorways, she noticed, with the same particular quality of stillness. She watched him understand this. She saw the moment it landed. "You are in the doorway," she said. He looked at her. "So I am." "It is your house." "I am aware." She held out her hand. He came in. He stood at the side of the bassinet and looked at the child with the expression of a man encountering something he has no previous framework for. He reached in and put one finger in the child's palm, and the child's hand closed around it with the automatic certainty of the newly arrived. "Good God," Julian said quietly. "Yes," Isabeau said. He stood there for a long time. She watched him. On her left hand, the 2 rings, her mother's, moved from right to left on a cliff path. His, given in a salt-bitten church, caught the morning light. They named her Marguerite. The second child came in 1821. and was a boy who arrived with an air of considerable self-importance that Henry said was entirely the Wren temperament, and Julian said was Henry's influence already, somehow from outside the womb. Thomas was loud and decided and laughed easily, which was nothing like Julian and somewhat like what Julian was becoming, gradually, in the way of people who are permitted to be themselves over time. The third arrived in 1824, another girl. She was quiet from the start, watchful, precise with her mother's habit of looking at things slightly longer than was socially usual. They named her Celeste. Henry was her godfather. He accepted this appointment with an emotion he described as practical satisfaction, and which manifested as a decade of gifts, stories, and occasional terrible advice that Celeste absorbed and filed with the same composure she brought to everything. In the summers, they went back to Dunmore Cove. It was Julian's idea the first time. The second time it was the children's. After that it was simply what they did, the way families do things that have become the shape of themselves. The house was not cold in July. The chimneys all worked, or most of them. The cliff path was dry, the sea was occasionally a colour other than pewter, and the library, reorganised by century and subject in the French section, a project that had never been undone, was full on rainy afternoons with children who had been told they could read anything, including the French, including the political philosophy. Marguerite read everything. Thomas read the ones with battles. Celeste, at 6 in the summer of 1830, selected a volume from the 17th century devotional section and sat with it in the chair by the window and did not appear to read it so much as commune with it, which was a trait Isabeau recognized. "She's on the same page," Julian said, appearing at Isabeau's shoulder. They were in the doorway, the library was warm, the children arranged in their various attitudes of reading. "Let her," Isabeau said. I did not say otherwise. She leaned back slightly, and he put his hand on her shoulder, and they stood in the doorway together watching. On the last evening of that summer, Isabeau stood at the window. The upstairs window, the one with the view of the cliff path and the sea. The same window where she had stood in October of 1818, before Julian arrived, with nothing in the house but herself and the sound of the wind. The same window she had stood at, the night of the second London letter, watching him on the path below. The sea was the same sea. It was always the same sea. "You're at the window," Julian said behind her. "Old habit." He came to stand beside her. Below, the cliff path was lit by the long July evening. Henry was somewhere on it, visible as a distant figure, having announced after supper that he required restorative solitude, and set off with the air of a man who would probably be back within 20 minutes and requiring an audience. "What are you looking for?" Julian said. She considered. It was the question she had never quite answered. Not in October, not on the cliff path, not in the kitchen in the early mornings. What does someone look for when they stand at a window and watch the path? "Nothing now," she said. He looked at her. "I was looking," she said, "for a long time. I didn't know what exactly. Something that had the shape of being somewhere that counted, of being known." He was quiet. "I'm not looking anymore," she said. He took her left hand. He held it, both rings under his thumb. Below, Henry turned and came back along the path toward the house, exactly as predicted, at the exact pace of a man who has remembered that solitude is less agreeable than company. "He lasted 11 minutes, Julian said. "You counted." "I estimated." She smiled. He saw it in the glass, reflected. The window was dark enough now to give them back to themselves. She looked at their reflections for a moment. Him, her, his hand holding hers, the rings. "Julian," she said. The next time you tell someone you've seen cleverer housemaids." "I haven't said it since." "I know." She looked at him in the glass. "I was going to say, if you ever do, make sure the housemaid isn't in the room." He looked at her reflection. She looked at his. Then he turned, away from the window, away from the sea and the reflected ghost of them, and he kissed her, properly, with the same quality of attention he had brought to the cliff path in October. Unhurried, decided, unconcerned with anything outside the room. Below, Henry arrived at the east gate, and let himself in and latched it behind him, and looked up at the first-floor window and took in what was visible through it, and looked away with the absolute discretion of a man who has been declining to see things for 12 years and has become very practiced at it. He went inside. The children were already asleep, the house quiet around them. Henry found the morning room, sat in the chair nearest the window, and picked up the book he had left there after supper. He did not read it. He held it and looked at the dark garden, and was content in the way of a man who has watched something good come to pass and knows his part in it, however inadvertent. The ring on Isabeau's left hand caught the last of the summer light as Julian's arms came around her, and then the light went, and the sea went dark, and the house held all of them, the 3 children sleeping, Henry with his unread book, the Duke and the woman who had come across the channel with nothing but a pamphlet and a ring and a name she had chosen not to use, and was warm.